So good morning, good morning, good morning. Is anybody else experiencing a lot of clouds and rain? I'm having a hard time
Yes.
staying awake. Oh,
It's nice though. We needed it.
yes, ma'am. My rose bushes were looking rough. All right, let me see if I can turn this lamp off. I look like I got jaundice. I'm all yellow over here. I feel a little better now. All right, so thank you so much, everybody, for joining me for this education today. I'm excited to present this information. I hope it will be helpful to those of you who are experiencing a caregiving journey where your loved one is declining, and they're facing the end of life, or possibly their diagnosis is going to lead to that. I know it's a delicate topic, and so I do hope that I can present this information with compassion and with kindness. And that's my goal, at least. I don't want anyone to feel as though the information I present is the only way that you're supposed to feel, or the only way that there is to grieve, because we all know that that's just not true. Grief is just as unique as every relationship. I truly believe that grief is just another expression of love, and that the harder we grieve, that's just indicative of how much we love the one that we lost. And so anticipatory grief is one of those things that I think people may not actually realize that that's what they're experiencing, because you've got everything else on top of it. You've got the tasks of the day, you've got the stress of the bills and everything else. And so sometimes those emotions can be buried under the to-do list, and so you might not even realize that you're experiencing anticipatory grief. So hopefully after today's presentation, you'll know what the signs are, because I feel like if you know what's happening, if you know what's going on, if you can name what's happening to you, it's a lot easier to cope. It's a lot easier to plan. And so that's the goal for today, is just kind of give you guys the validation of how you're feeling, and to maybe give you some tips on how to navigate those tough emotions. So it's a little bit after 10, so I'll go ahead and get started. I don't think this is going to be as long as some of the education that I've given, but we'll see. If we cut out a little early, there'll just be room for conversation. And since this is a more intimate topic, if there is time afterwards for us to have conversation and anyone wants to share, I will stop the recording so it won't be shared online, because all of our recordings are posted on our website for future viewing. And so I don't want anyone to feel restricted in sharing because they're afraid it's going to be on the internet. So that'll definitely be an option later on as we close. But before we do get started, Shirley's already ahead of the game. If you all could please put your email addresses in the chat box so that I can take attendance. This also allows me to send you all the post-education surveys so I can get your feedback, so I can know how well or how not well this education is benefiting everyone involved. Looks like we got a few more people connecting in here, which is wonderful. I see a few new names, so that's also wonderful. Welcome, welcome. And I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen again here. There we go. And if at any time you have any comments or questions that you want to ask, if you want to just type it in the chat, that's fine. I can address it afterwards, or, again, we can have that conversation after the presentation, okay? All right, so let's get started. We're going to talk today about recognizing and coping with anticipatory grief. We're going to define it. We're going to talk about the signs so that you can recognize it in your own behaviors and in your own life. We're going to talk about if there's any benefits to anticipatory grief. I know our culture likes to tell us, there's good feelings and there's bad feelings, there's good emotions and there's bad emotions. I don't believe any of that. I think all emotions are good in that they help us process what we experience in life. And so even though grief is what some would categorize as a negative emotion, I feel that there are some benefits to feeling those feelings and working through them. So we'll discuss that today. We're going to talk about 5 ways to help you work through anticipatory grief. And we're going to talk about unresolved grief, the symptoms and strategies. I know that again, I talk about our culture all the time because we're just consumed by it, but we do like to kind of bury things that are unpleasant. We don't like to feel the things that make us feel uncomfortable. And so a lot of us are walking around every day, even to this day, with unresolved grief from a loss in our past or, a loss to come. And so I'm going to give you some tips on how to process unresolved grief. Okay. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So what is anticipatory grief? It's very common among both caregivers and the ones you're caring for, and they often occur simultaneously. So if you have a loved one who has a diagnosis that gives them a time frame of, of potentially when the disease is going to progress and their life will be cut short, they're grieving as well. Okay, there's a lot of loss there for both of you. And so it's good to know what the signs are. So that way, if your loved one is behaving in a way that maybe makes you feel bad, or they're angry or frustrating to you, it may just be them not knowing what to do with their grief as well. And so understanding that can allow you to have more compassion for the person you're caring for, and ultimately more compassion for yourself. Okay. Anticipatory grief is a state of deep, painful sorrow that occurs before an impending loss. It can affect people facing the impending death of a loved one or their own death. It's often used in context of death, but it can also encompass the impending loss of things not related to death. So if you are experiencing anticipatory grief of maybe you're about to have, maybe like a mastectomy, or maybe you're facing divorce or something like that, there's a loss coming down the road and you're anticipating that loss, you're anticipating that grief. But of course, today we're going to talk about it in the context of someone passing. Again, anticipatory grief is common in both caregivers and those being cared for. Anticipatory grief is more than just normal grieving that starts early. Okay, it's often regarded as a means to process and resolve issues related to a dying person. And it may provide you with the means to proactively address your feelings and the likely consequences of the loss. So dealing with them now rather than after the fact. But with any grief reaction, obviously, there's no set amount of time or amount of grief that a person's going to face. And experiencing anticipatory grief before the death of a loved one, it doesn't mean that the grief after the loss will be less. So it's not like you have this finite amount of grief and you'll do half now and half later. Okay. Grief, as we all know, I'm sure many of us have already had losses in our lives, or we're old enough to understand the impact of loss in our lives. And we know that grief comes in waves. Sometimes it comes in trickles, but it almost never leaves us, right? Just like the love we have for that individual is never truly going to leave. Grief is just a way that another form of expression of that love. And so it will kind of come in different ways. So again, I don't want you to feel like there's a standard way to grieve. Okay. Let's see what's next here. I talked past my notes, so I got lost. Okay. So anticipatory grief versus grief after death, what's the difference? So anticipatory grief is very similar to conventional grief insofar as that they both involve many of the same emotions. But with conventional grief, the emotions you're experiencing are the direct consequence of a loss, right? Somebody lost, so you lost somebody and you're feeling that grief. But anticipatory grief is the grief that you expect to experience, much of which is conceptual, and it can change over time. Okay. It's often or sometimes described as a roller coaster because you can shift back and forth between feeling distressed for several days and feeling normal for several days. And I know that can be kind of confusing when you feel this, stop you in your tracks sorrow for a couple days, and then you wake up and you're not feeling that anymore. That's very tiresome on your system. And so it can be very draining to experience that back and forth. There also may be part of you that's clinging to a hope that maybe the diagnosis is wrong, and that could maybe buoy you at the moment and trigger intense anxiety in another. So with conventional grief, your emotions and actions are reactive, okay? And with anticipatory grief, your emotions and actions are proactive. Okay, so again, anticipatory grief doesn't necessarily lessen the grief you will experience after the loss. This is very much going to be, they're the same, but they're also very different. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Let's see. So what are the symptoms of anticipatory grief? And now you'll see a lot of the same symptoms or the symptoms in conventional grief as you'll see anticipatory grief, but they are a little bit different. So, and this is not inclusive, all inclusive, right? This is just a standard, generalized list of symptoms. So loss of control of your emotions. So that could include intense sadness and tearfulness that comes out of nowhere, or you're easily triggered. Okay, and if you've already lost someone in the past, you understand this all too well. You'll be fine one moment, and the next moment, just something very small sets you off and you're back in tears again, okay? And that's normal, and that's okay. When that happens, you just let it loose, all right? If you've been to any of my trainings, you know that I am not a fan of bottled and unexpressed emotions. So if you feel it, let yourself feel it, okay? Fear, irritability, and anger is another symptom. So beyond the fear of death, you might fear the changes that will follow a death, right? Especially if you're losing a spouse or somebody that you've built your life with. Things will be much different for you after they are gone. And so it's okay to process those things. In addition to dealing with your own anger, you may have to deal with the anger of the dying person, right? We talked about you guys can simultaneously be experiencing anticipatory grief. And maybe that makes things, where you're at each other's throats sometimes. So if that happens, just try to take a breath, step back and understand you're feeling it, they're feeling it, okay? And you may be in a better cognitive space to process it than they are, okay? So let's try to work with grace for both them and ourselves. Next, loneliness and isolation. Caregivers can often find others backing away from them during a serious health crisis. Preaching to the choir, I'm sure. But on the other hand, if you have anticipatory anxiety, you'll often feel lethargic and unmotivated and will readily withdraw from social situations. So the loneliness and isolation is almost like a double-edged sword where, people are backing away and you're also retreating at the same time. And so that can make that gap between support seem even wider. So it's good to be aware of that and be proactive and make choices so that you are fighting against that reaction to withdraw and isolate, because it's not going to help you in the long run. Next, anxiety. Caregivers often feel like they're living in a state of heightened anxiety, manifesting trembling, edginess, a racing heart, and other symptoms. I feel like anxiety is just par for the course when you're caretaking. So it could kind of get lost in the jumble of all the other feelings that you're feeling. And so anxiety might not be a singular indicator of anticipatory grief, but it definitely always finds its way into the pot, right? I feel like anxiety is like the salt of our emotions. It just seems to be in everything. You put it in everything, right? It's just part of being a human being. Next, we have guilt. So this one I feel is very taboo to talk about, right? So feelings of guilt can occur if you want a loved one to be free of pain, even if it means they're dying. Or you may feel the opposite and want a loved one to stay, even if it means suffering. So this is very tricky, right? Because guilt is a very heavy thing to carry. And I know as caregivers, guilt is just also something that you carry with you regardless of the situation, because you think I could be doing this for them. I should have done that. I should have done this for myself. And so there's guilt coming from you from every angle, but especially if you're seeing the end near for your loved one, and that desire for them to be at peace can bring you a lot of guilt. I know just a personal story. My grandmother cared for her mother for about 5 years before she passed. She had dementia, and she was in her late 90s when she passed. And my grandmother felt a lot of guilt after she died because she said, I feel relieved. And that's a complex place to be, right? Because she loved her mother and she didn't want her to pass away, but it was such a hard job to take care of her that when she did finally end her journey here on this earth, my grandmother felt relief, and she felt a lot of guilt for feeling relief. And so I just want you to know that that's normal, okay? All feelings are valid, and if you are feeling guilt about your loved one passing, or them wanting them to stick around even if they're suffering, Don't beat yourself up for that, okay? That's normal. Next, we have intense preoccupation with a dying person. So this can occur to the point of fixation, and that can make it difficult to manage your health, your work, or daily living, right? So you are so attentive and so concerned for your loved one that that's all you do. You obsess over their health, you obsess over their comfort, their treatments, what have you. And so that could be a symptom of anticipatory grief. And finally, the rehearsal of the death. So you might be visualizing what it'll be like without your loved one, right? You may be sitting awake at night thinking how things are going to be different, how things are going to change. Also, the person you're caring for might be imagining how you and other loved ones will carry on once they're gone, okay? And that can be hard. I know, I think, you know, if I were to leave my children behind or my husband behind, you know, how would they manage? How would they cope? And that can be very stressful to kind of be in that headspace all the time. And so if you're experiencing any of these symptoms, you may be experiencing anticipatory grief. Next, we're going to talk about if there's benefits to anticipatory grief. So studies are pretty conflicted on whether there is benefits to it. And it appears to differ by the individual. Okay, so some people may find benefits in it. Other people, it may just prolong their suffering. And so it's not very good for them. So yeah, so some people might feel like as though they can sort their feelings out and make preparations for moving forward. And some people, you know, they just sit in it and they never really progress past it. So some of the benefits that bereavement experts say are available to us through anticipatory grief is you can confront your fears rather than avoid them. Okay, just take a very realistic approach to the loss. It gives you an opportunity to deal with any unfinished business, both practical and emotional, okay? Clarifying any misunderstanding or express what you should have said earlier. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we go into coping strategies. It gives you an opportunity to say your goodbyes, okay? Sometimes people leave us very quickly and we don't have that opportunity. But if we know that somebody's nearing the end of their life, we have that precious time to say our goodbyes and make the most of the time we have left. And you can also take this time to make preparations for your life moving forward. And this could allow you to have less distress and be better able to navigate the bereavement when your loved one passes on. Okay, so again, you can see how this really just depends on the person. Some people can take this and be very proactive. Other people can take this and not be so proactive, right? So it depends on who you are as an individual. So anticipatory grief might serve as a prelude to conventional grief for many of us, neither bolstering you for the harsh reality of your loss or preparing you for the life ahead. But some studies have shown that anticipatory grief can be like holding your breath until the real pain begins. So it doesn't really allow you to navigate it any better. It just is just kind of this tense anxiety feeling until finally you can release that breath, okay? So one study issued by the National Cancer Institute found that widows who stayed with their dying husbands until death could only truly mourn once their death had occurred. So it's almost as if this anticipatory grief left them in a limbo, right, where they couldn't really process the loss until the loss occurred. And that's pretty normal, right? I would feel like, you know, you don't finish grieving prior to the loss, right? So anticipatory grief might make the conventional grief easier to handle, but it could just prolong it. And so there's something called prolonged grief disorder, or PGD, and the American Psychiatric Association says that between 7 and 10% of bereaved adults meet the criteria for this disorder. So symptoms persisting for 6 months or more could include feeling that a part of oneself has died, a sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of anything that reminds them about the death, difficulty engaging with friends, pursuing interest, or planning for the future, emotional numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, feeling alone or detached from others. Okay, so this is, I think everyone feels this, or I shouldn't say everyone, but I feel this is a very common list of emotions that people go through when they're grieving. But if this is kind of where you are 6 months or longer after the loss, you may be experiencing prolonged grief disorder. So some people, you know, find that processing grief grief prior to the loss can help them, and so they don't ever find themselves in this prolonged grief. But other people, you know, it's just one more stage of their grief, right? They've got the anticipatory grief, then they've got the prolonged grief. And I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with the idea of prolonged grief being the word, because, you know, grief is, there's no timetable for it. But it's kind of where you're in that initial sense, you know, like that person has just passed within a couple of days, and you are still feeling those emotions, those feelings as intense 6 months later as you did 2 days after the passing. Okay, so this is where getting to know yourself is really important. So you know, where am I on this scale? Where am I going to have to reach out for support because I'm having a hard time moving forward or processing these emotions? Okay. So here are 5 ways to help you process through anticipatory grief. Okay. Again, these are just suggestions. They are not, you know, a magic potion or step-by-step cure-all for anybody. And some of these might help you. None of these might help you. Okay. But these are just 5 ways that maybe you can keep in mind to see about working through your anticipatory grief. So the first and foremost, we allow feelings of grief to help us prepare. So we talked about this a little earlier. You can take time to examine unresolved issues between you and your loved ones. So you can say what needs to be said. I know a lot of caregivers are caring for parents, and you know, that relationship with your parent has changed a lot because, you know, they were caring for you and now you're caring for them. And so maybe there were some unresolved issues that you had prior to their diagnosis that maybe you were never able to fully express to them. Maybe you had a wonderful relationship with your loved one, and you know, the only thing that's left unsaid is I love you and I'm going to miss you. But some of us haven't always had those experiences. So maybe there are some unresolved traumas or negative, quote unquote, negative conversations that we have to have if our loved one is well enough and obviously cognitively capable of having those conversations. This is a great time for you to be able to have those so that you can have that closure. If your family member is well enough, you can settle legal and financial matters and discuss end of life wishes. I know not all of us have the privilege of being able to have those conversations with our loved ones towards the end, but if you are, working through those can definitely help make that transition a lot easier for everyone involved. Next, educate yourself about what to expect. It's kind of hard to say, well, this is how you're going to feel, this is what grief looks like, but you know, we are all human beings and we all have similar experiences. So, you know, you can read up on it, educate yourself what you think is going to come down the pipeline about grief, but also about your family member or your loved one's condition. So knowing symptoms and side effects from any treatments, understanding what's coming down the pike might help you feel in control. Okay. Again, I'll reference back to my grandmother. She didn't really know what to expect when her mother started to slip away. And so it was a very terrifying process for her. And so a way that that can be avoided is to just understand what's to be expected, what's normal, what's abnormal, because it helps us feel in control. It helps us feel like we can get through those phases and stages when we know what's coming. Next, we can talk to somebody who is also feeling anticipatory grief. Okay, so support groups are great for this, whether it's online, in person, or even over the phone. Someone in a similar situation can provide a lot of insight. Sometimes it's just saying how you feel and someone saying, I feel that way too, right? Sometimes that's all we need. It's okay to be honest about your feelings, and you're not being disrespectful to your family member or your loved one if you express frustration. Okay. Again, I will always advocate for authentic expression of emotion as long as it's within a safe space and it's not harming anybody else. We don't have to feel ashamed for feeling the things we feel, even if it is frustration, you know, especially if you're dealing with someone who has a degenerative disease, and towards the end, the caregiving becomes more complex and it becomes more intense. And so it's very easy to be stressed, overwhelmed, frustrated, and incredibly sad at the same time. And that can lead to a lot of undesirable reactions. Okay, so this is where being self-aware is going to be very, very helpful for you. And talking to other people can allow you to be more introspective on how you're feeling. Next, enlist help and continue to live your life. This can be difficult for people who think, well, I only have these few moments with my loved one, right? I don't want to waste them spending time with my friends, okay? But if you're reaching out to friends and family or hiring someone to help you with the care, and not putting your life on hold, you are still, if this is a place of time, or this is a point in time where you're probably going to be at the peak of your I can't even, right? And when we're more stressed, we're more frustrated, and we're grieving, we have to allow ourselves outlets for those feelings. So that way, when we are with our loved one, those final moments can be less stressful and more pleasant. And we're building really great bonds and memories with our loved one at the end, rather than being explosive and angry and, just boiling because we're so underneath it. Okay, so you're not wasting time by relieving your stress towards the end. Okay, it is for the betterment of you and your loved one, because you don't want them, you don't want to be so stressed and overwhelmed that you are not making the most out of those moments. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So in the long run, it'll help you be patient, and you'll have more energy to care for your loved one and do what you need to do. Okay, because end of life isn't just about the passing of your loved one. There's also a lot of tasks involved, right? Funeral arrangements, end of life planning, that kind of thing. So you want to make sure that you're still taking care of yourself and you're still leaning on the support systems that you have. Okay. And then finally, create moments with your loved one that you can both enjoy. So even though they maybe aren't as able to participate in the activities like they used to be, they can still enjoy pleasurable activities with you. So maybe take mom outside for some fresh air, play some music that they enjoy, do simple puzzles if they're able to. So in the end, these moments might be what you cherish most. Okay. And again, it's going to be really difficult for you to sit and do a puzzle with mom if you're at your the end of your rope and stressed out, right? So take those moments to yourself, so that when you have those puzzle moments with your loved one, you're not as frustrated and you can really be present with them. So now we're going to talk about unresolved grief. Okay. Unresolved grief is probably going to be something you'll experience. Hopefully no one will experience this, but a lot of us do. It'll be after the fact. Okay, so this is not going to be anticipatory unresolved grief. This is going to be, after the fact that your loved one has passed. So healthy grief is what we experience when we allow ourselves to feel our pain and our loss. We take the time to identify and understand what we're feeling, and over time we come to accept what's happened. Even though we never lose the pain of missing the person that has passed, we're still able to continue living and experience happiness. Okay, so healthy grief, there's really not a timeline for it. There's not a specific roadmap for it, but we do know that eventually a healthy grieving process will resolve into being able to live your life and experience happiness even after you've lost someone that you really love. Excuse me. And as humans, we live through our intellect, right? We're planning our actions and our reactions, but grief is not an intellectual reaction at all. It's an emotional one. And so we can't think ourselves through grief, and we have to experience it. Okay, you have to just kind of be in the muck for a while if you're going to resolve your grief. So you need to climb into the roller coaster and let go. It's okay to hurt, and it's okay to lose your way. Telling yourself that you're fine when you're not fine, it just buries the pain even deeper. And you can try to ignore it and carry on as normal. And you might even tell yourself that you'll be okay in a certain amount of time that maybe somebody told you was going to take, how long it's going to take to grieve. But it's not true. If you don't do anything, you just get used to bearing the pain and you build your life around it. It's there and it'll remain there unresolved until you do something about it. So that's what grief is, right? You can no more control it than predict it. But it's much easier to bear your sadness if you aren't also berating yourself for being sad. We're allowed to be sad, and we're allowed to be sad for as long as we need to be sad. So our society tells us that we need to seek easy and instant results to almost everything. So it's important that we learn the benefits and the beauty of patience with ourselves, effort, and perseverance when we're experiencing emotional trauma. So, and one note about emotional trauma, I heard it described as like an emotional wounding. Okay, so if you break your leg, you're not going to say, I'm fine, it doesn't hurt, I'm just going to continue to walk around and do my normal daily activities, right? That would be a little crazy to think about that way. But yeah, we do that with our emotions all the time. Okay, so if you're experiencing grief, it is an emotional wounding that needs time to heal. Okay, so what does unresolved grief look like? Well, some of the symptoms could be you don't want to speak about or acknowledge the loss, right? Maybe you're in denial, or maybe it hurts too much to talk about it. Okay, and that's normal in the beginning. Okay, but again, if you say you're not grieving, but you can't talk about it, you say you're okay, but you can't talk about it, you're probably not okay. All right. Overactivity. So you're either working too hard or spending too much time on a hobby to distract yourself. I'm sure some of us are already doing that now, right? It's very easy to get caught up in distractions. It's disassociating from the pain we're feeling. And that's a normal reaction, okay? Nobody likes to sit in that funk, but sometimes we have to force ourselves to do so. Maybe you started to isolate and detach yourself from family and friends, okay? Especially if you have people who were close to you and your loved one before they passed, you know, maybe other siblings, maybe children. And it could be hard to be around them because you see their grief and you don't want to catch it or something, you know, or it reminds you of your own grief. And that can be very hard if you haven't processed it yet. It can be like somebody, you know, throwing salt in the wound. And so you start to isolate and detach from them. You're indulging in bad habits. So that could be overeating, that could be undereating, drinking too much alcohol, other risky behaviors that maybe you weren't engaging in before. That could be an indicator that you're experiencing unresolved grief. Again, you're trying to distract yourself. You're trying to numb yourself, okay? You're sleeping more than usual. You're overreacting to relatively small events, okay? That means that you've lit that fuse is lit, right? And that it's really short. And so any little thing can set you off because you are experiencing an emotional wound. So your emotions are going to be reactive in that way. Just like if you get a burn on your hand, you know, even just a light touch can feel like a searing pain, right? It's very similar to that. And you can avoid getting close to people and starting new relationships for fear of being hurt, right? Especially if you're losing a spouse, you might think I'll never love again, and so you shut yourself down. Or if you've lost, you know, a good friend or a parent, somebody that you trusted and that was very meaningful in your life, it can be very difficult for you to find other strong and worthwhile relationships after the fact if you have unresolved grief, because you think it's just going to keep hurting. I don't want to lose another person. Okay. But again, if you've processed your grief and you've experienced a healthy grieving process, it'll be a lot easier for you to pick up other relationships because you know, yeah, it might end in hurt, but I can process through it and it's okay. Okay. So if you do not do anything to reconcile your losses, it doesn't matter how much time passes, the pain still remains and will be as strong as ever. That adage that time heals all wounds, I don't believe that's true. Sometimes putting a Band-Aid over a wound just allows it time to fester and get worse. And so it doesn't matter how much time has passed, if you haven't done the work to feel your feelings and process your grief, it's just going to stay there and it's going to fester. Okay. So completing the grief process. So anticipatory grief can help you to process through your grief. But I think even if you are not experiencing anticipatory grief, you still need to complete that grief process. So getting closure, one effective way of doing this is by writing out your thoughts, talking with other loved ones and friends about the loss, okay? That can help you just process. We're verbal creatures, we're cerebral creatures, we're communal creatures, and being around people that can help us process that grief get that closure is going to be very, very helpful moving forward. Okay. And if you don't have someone that you can talk to, which is fine, writing it down, as long as you are acknowledging how you're feeling, even if it's just to yourself, can be very helpful. Next, moving toward what you might be avoiding. So maybe you're avoiding the gravesite, right? Maybe you're avoiding family gatherings. Maybe you're avoiding cleaning out their closets after they've passed. Okay. Very difficult things to do. Very difficult things to do, but not impossible. And so moving towards those activities can help us complete the grief process. Next, behaviorally change your patterns. So if you've fallen into bad patterns, you probably want to change them, right? If you started drinking a lot or isolating or what have you, they're not, those patterns are maybe helpful in the short term, but in the long term, they're not going to help you process that grief. It's not going to help you complete that grieving process. So pushing against your anxiety-driven behaviors can help you feel more in control and stop that negative cycle, okay? Finally, consider therapy. So it's very difficult and it's often tied to other core issues. Grief is, it's a good time to consult with a therapist, even if it's just for a short amount of time, okay? There are specific grief counselors out there. You're not going to be with them for a long time. Maybe you're just with them for a couple months or a year or however long it takes to kind of hold your hand while you go through that process. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. Grief is about you and your relationships with others, and it helps to have others help you with your grief. Okay. Again, we are not intended to be solitary creatures. Okay. Now, I'm speaking as an introvert here. Okay. I have to have my solitude. I have to have my quiet time, but I can't remain in that space and be mentally healthy. Okay. None of us can. So instead of pushing people away during this time, we need to bring people closer. Okay. Because that's just part of how we're wired as a human species. Okay. We are wired for family. We're wired for connection. We are wired for support. That's why we are compassionate and empathetic and all those things. Okay. So really, really embrace those moments, that time when it comes up and you can talk to somebody about it. You can lean on somebody for support. Take advantage of those moments. Okay. And that'll help you complete the grieving process. So I said this was going to be a little shorter than our hour, and here we are at the very end. I know some of this information might be stuff you already knew. Some of it might just give you maybe something new to think about, but maybe it's just kind of validated how you're feeling. And I think that's just as important as learning something new. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing now. And I will also pause our recording if I can figure out how to do that. There we go.